Hi, it's AJ. Welcome back to Effortless English. Today I want to talk to you about a metaphor. What's a metaphor? Some of you have studied English, you know the word metaphor. A metaphor is kind of a story or a picture that helps you understand a difficult or complex or complicated idea. For example, English fluency, speaking English quickly, easily, and automatically. Well, what do you need to know? What do you need to do to speak English confidently, to feel strong when you speak, and to speak quickly, easily, and automatically? What do you need? Well, I have a story, a metaphor to help you understand this. I call it the engine of fluency. Of course, fluency means fast, confident, automatic speaking. Fast, confident, automatic speaking. That's what you want. So how do you get there? That's the destination. That's where you want to go. But how do you get there? You're here now. Probably if you are watching this, you do not speak English quickly, easily, automatically, and confidently. But you want to. So how do you go from here, where you are now? Maybe you're low, high beginner, maybe you're advanced, but you want to improve, you want to speak confidently, quickly, easily. You want to speak fluently. Or if we use the noun, you want fluency. Fluency, the ability to speak quickly, confidently, easily. How do you get there? It seems complicated, right? There's so much to think about. Grammar, vocabulary, all these different ideas that I talk about in my videos. Well, let me help you organize these ideas. I call this the idea of the engine of fluency, right? You imagine a car. A car has an engine, right? It's the power of the car. The engine makes the car move, right? You want to move. You want to go from this point where you are now to English fluency, speaking confidently and easily. So you need an engine. You need some kind of power, an engine to move you to this. And there are two parts of the effortless English engine of fluency, the fluency engine. We have two parts of this engine. Well, number one, what do you need for an engine? Well, all engines need fuel, right? Gasoline, fuel. All engines need fuel. All engines need gas. And of course, then, all engines need a motor. The motor, the thing that moves, and it will push you or push the car forward. But a motor with no fuel, it can't move. Fuel with no motor, it just burns. Nothing happens. You don't move. You've got to have really great fuel, really great gasoline. You have to have a really great engine. And when you put those together, you got a great engine, you put great fuel, great gasoline into it, whoom, you go very fast. So you understand? This is the idea of the fluency engine. So what am I talking about? Right? You're like, okay, AJ, nice idea. What do you mean? What is the fuel? What is the engine? Well, the engine, you know. The engine is the 7 rules. You can imagine in an engine there's pistons. Pistons are the things that move up and down for the power, right? So imagine in the effortless English motor, the engine, the part that moves. In the motor of effortless English, we have 7 pistons. 7 pistons, 7 rules that push and move the car, that will push and move you to fluency, right? It's each of the 7 rules. But just knowing those rules, it's not enough. You need one more thing, right? You need fuel. You need gasoline. What is that? That is emotion. energy, beliefs. What I say is the psychology of success. That's the fuel, that's the power, that's the energy. You need both. Right? Some people have a lot of fuel, but they have a very bad motor. I'll give you an example. In my opinion, most Korean students, for example, have a lot of fuel. What do I mean by that? It means they work very hard. They want success. They will study hours and hours every day to improve their English. They have a strong desire to learn and improve. They have big reasons. Maybe they need to pass a test so they can get a better job. Maybe they want to be leaders, global leaders. They have the motivation. They have strong psychology. What's the problem? They use terrible methods. Really bad methods. The motor, right? The methods are bad. They're studying grammar all the time. They try to remember long lists of vocabulary. They do these stupid little communication exercises in English classes. Hi, how are you? I'm fine, and you? I'm fine. Where did you go today? I went to the store. Terrible. So all these little stupid discussions in their classes and memorizing lists of words and studying and remembering grammar rules. So that's their problem, right? It's just terrible methods. They've got the energy, they've got the motivation, they have the desire, they have the hard work, but they're using it in a bad motor. It's like putting, race car fuel into a broken motor. Nothing is going to happen. It's going to be frustrating. And that's what happens with a lot of students in Korea and in Japan and, in fact, most of Asia. Really, in fact, probably a lot of the world, but it's very strong in Asia. Now, there's another problem. Some people get my 7 rules. I see it all the time on my blog, on the websites, emails we get. They get the 7 rules. The 7 rules, that's a great idea. It's a good method. But here's their problem. I see this sometimes with members. Their psychology is weak. They have no patience, for example. They start using the effortless English lessons. After 1 week, what's happening? I don't want to study deeply. I'm getting frustrated. I don't speak yet perfectly. I'm not improving fast enough. After a short time, right? They get frustrated very, very quickly. They become bored quickly. Their energy is low. They're tired easily. Or they don't have a big motivation. They're just focusing on some test score. They don't have a bigger, deeper reason to learn English. This is also a problem. So they have this great method that I have given them. This motor, right? They've got the motor. It's like a race car motor. A Lamborghini, a Porsche. But they're putting terrible fuel, gasoline, dirty, no energy, gasoline or fuel into that motor. What happens? Again, bad results. There's no movement. There's no strong power. You must have both. Now, I usually start with the psychology. The first thing you need to do, get that energy, get the fuel. You got to have something to put in, right? So you got to manage your emotions. You have to manage your beliefs. You have to manage your body right now. Do it. Get your shoulders back. Get a big smile on your face. Big deep breath. Focus on the positive. Focus on success. Imagine becoming a confident speaker. Imagine being a leader, a global leader. Imagine success. And do this all the time, every day, especially before you listen to English. So that's the first thing. You got to get that fuel. This is something you must do all the time. You can't stop doing it. One day your shoulders back, chest up, breathing, smiling, feeling good. Yes, yes, good fuel. And then the next day, you're like this. That's no good. It has to be every time, consistent. Strong psychology consistently. Great, powerful fuel consistently. And then you put it in a motor that's powerful and strong. The Effortless English System or Effortless English Lessons. That's the combination, right? So if you're a member, if you have my lessons, or if you get my VIP lessons, which are going to be fantastic, my job is the motor, okay? I'm giving you that motor. All my lessons use all the 7 rules. You know the 7 rules. I gave you all of those videos and emails free. So you know the motor. I've given that to you. But you are responsible for the fuel, right? For that gasoline, for that emotional and psychological power. You have to do it. Now, I will teach you, I will coach you with this. I will tell you, get your shoulders back, get your chest up, smile, move your body, shout your answers. I will help you create more strong beliefs. I will help you become more confident. But still, finally, it's your job. I can coach you, I can recommend, I can suggest what you should do, but finally, you must do it. You must manage your body so that your shoulders are back and your chest is up and you're smiling and you're moving and you're shouting your answers. And you're changing your beliefs. You're becoming more confident. That's your job, your responsibility. That's your part. I give you the best lessons I can give you. That motor, I give you a race car motor with Effortless English. With my original lessons and certainly with this VIP program, it's going to be a fantastic motor. Video and audio lessons. I'll talk about that in a minute. And I'm also going to coach you about the psychology of success, about the fuel, so that you have that great, strong energy. Every time, every month, you're going to get these lessons, but inside those lessons, the topics will always be about psychology and success and confidence and leadership. That's how I'm coaching you and helping you to create that in your body, in your mind, in your emotion and feeling. For English learning and for all of your life. I want you to be successful in all of your life. I want you to be confident in all of your life. But finally, you must choose to do it. I can give all of this to you, but if you do nothing, if you ignore me, if you just sit like this, your progress will be slow. If you listen to me, you use the lessons, you follow the system, and you get that strong psychology, that fuel, that energy, you will have incredible, incredible success. So that's my promise to you. That's my responsibility for giving you, and then you also have that job to actually do it and use it. And I'm sure you will. I hope you will. So, good luck to you. And just remember this thing in your mind. You have to have the fuel, the gasoline, the energy. That's emotion. That's confidence. That's psychology. And you have to have the motor, or the actual engine. That's the method that I'm giving you. Those 7 rules, the lessons. Put those together. Pow! Big power, fast results, and finally, confident, quick, automatic English speaking. You can do it. I promise you. Just use both of these methods, both of these elements, both of these parts. Put them together every time. That's the secret to big, strong, powerful success with your effortless English learning. Okay? Great. So now let me talk about the VIP program a little bit. So the VIP program is coming soon. So what is this VIP program? Well, let me tell you, first of all, the why of the program. So I think why is usually the most important question to ask first. Why? And then I'll tell you what it is. First of all, the why. Why this VIP program? Well, I decided after Power English was a huge, huge success. It's closed now. I'm not taking any new Power English students. Maybe next year. But I realized that, wow, we do have some members who really want new things from me. And I also realized something else more important, is that we had members and fans who want something deeper. Not just English lessons. Of course, all of you want to speak English quickly, easily, automatically, confidently. You want more vocabulary and grammar, better pronunciation, all of those things. I know that, of course you do. But I realized with Power English, as I'm getting emails and looking at the forums now, and the Power English students, you know what they're excited about? It's not the vocabulary and the grammar lessons. You know what they're excited about? They are excited about the ideas, because they are learning how to be successful in their life. They're learning exactly how, step by step, to have a strong psychology, strong emotions, how to be successful in all parts of their life, including English, but not only English. And so I realized, you know what? I need to do something more. So I want to create a program where I can do something new every month. And it can be a new topic every month. And especially because I'm always learning. You know, I'm always learning about business. I'm always learning about leadership. I'm always learning more about success. So I'm getting new ideas all the time. So I wanted to create something so that when I get a new idea, I can share it immediately, every month. But I also wanted to attract really people who want great English for a reason. And this is the important part. This is the key to the VIP program. It's not just an English program. Yes, I'm going to send you a bunch of lessons. I'll talk about that later. But the important part is why. What's the focus? What are we going to learn in those lessons? What's the topic of each lesson? And what I want to focus on is leadership and success. The secrets of leadership, the secrets of success. I want to teach you to be successful and then to be a global leader. Because I ask myself the question, why study English? Why? What is the reason? What do you want from me and my lessons? I mean, really, what do you want? Why are we doing this? Pass a test? Some of you maybe pass a test. If that is your only reason, do not get my VIP program. Don't do it. I don't want you in the program, quite honestly. You know, I said this for Power English. I told people, if you're negative, if you're this, I don't want you. Some people, they don't believe me. They think, oh, no, he's just saying that. No, I'm not just saying it. Because if you get the VIP program and you don't have a deeper purpose, a deeper reason, and if you're writing on my forums, my member forums, and you're just talking about test all the time, I will give you back your money and goodbye. I do not want that in the VIP program. The VIP program is a very special program for only a special kind of person. So let me tell you who it's for. What is the purpose of the VIP program? Here's what I'm going to give you in the VIP program. Number one, I'm talking about personal success, confidence and success in your life. So yes, you're going to learn a lot of English, but you're also going to learn the secrets to personal success. I want you to learn how to make a lot of money, to have a great career or job, or to make your own business and to be very, very successful. And I'll talk about why. It's not just so you can buy a lot of cars and nice clothes, okay? Because I don't really care about that stuff. But I do want you to be successful. Money's important in the world. And we can do a lot of good things with money. Some people do bad things with money. A lot of people do great, very good things with money. Well, the kind of leaders we're going to do good things with money. So yes, I'm going to teach you. How have I built my own successful business? How did I become successful? And even more important, not just me, but I am constantly learning. I go to seminars all the time about leadership and success. I'm learning from the best people. So I want to share their ideas with you also. But it's not just money. I want you to be healthy, right? Part of being successful, personally successful, is having a lot of energy in your body, right? Having a very strong, healthy body. And I want to teach you about that because I do have a strong, healthy body. I have a lot of energy. I'm 41 years old, but I have more energy than most 20-year-olds that I know and that I have met. They're always tired and complaining, and I'm like, let's go, I have energy, I have energy. So I want you to learn the secrets to having that health and that energy. Why? I'll talk about it in a minute. So I want you to be healthy. I want you to be very successful. I also want to teach you how to be successful, of course, with English. What do I mean by that? Not just a lot of vocabulary. Yes, you need to know a lot of words and phrases, especially phrases. I want you to speak with better grammar, of course. I want you to have better pronunciation. Yes, of course. But the most important thing, more important than those three things, is confidence. That feeling of being both strong and relaxed at the same time. I want you to feel strong and relaxed when you speak English. Because you speak English quickly, easily, automatically. You understand English quickly, easily, and automatically. And you have a strong psychology, a strong body, strong beliefs, strong ideas, so that you feel strong and relaxed and very, very confident every time you speak. You're not shy, you're not talking quiet. You feel strong and happy and relaxed and confident when you speak English every time you speak English. That is success, real success with English. So, purpose number one for the VIP program, the number one thing I want to give you is confidence and success with English speaking and with all of your life, and tell you exactly how to do it step by step by step. And also by giving you great, powerful lessons, which I'll talk about in a later video. Now, there's also another level, because then the next question for me is, okay, confidence and a lot of money and feeling strong and healthy and being successful in all your life. Why? For what reason? What will you do with that money? What will you do with that energy in your body? What will you do with your confident, fast, automatic English? I mean, what's the reason? Now, everybody has personal reasons. You can get a better job and, pass the test and, go to school and improve your business. Those are personal success reasons. They're important. I will help you with that. I will teach you that. But there's also another level, even more, because after you have personal success in your life, I also want you to give to other people, to become a leader, a global leader, a world leader. I don't mean president of a country. When I say a leader, I mean someone who helps other people, someone who gives to other people, someone who teaches other people. In any way, everybody's different. Maybe in a small way. Maybe you help your family and your friends in a small way. Maybe you teach them to be more confident. Maybe you help them become more successful in their life, in their business, in their career, or to be more healthy or be more happy. Maybe you can help them with your money. Maybe you can give your money to a charity to help children or animals or the environment, or many different things you can do with your success, with your confidence. With your English, I hope you will teach other people the effortless English system. I hope you will encourage them. So many English students, they feel bad. They think they are failing. And they feel frustrated. They're unhappy. You can give them something. You can give them more confidence. You can say, don't worry, you can do it. You can show them the 7 rules. You can be a leader in your job, in your career, in your family, with your friends. In so many ways, you can become a global leader, a true leader. And in my mind, in my belief, a true leader is not a boss. I'm not a boss. I don't want to be a boss. A true leader is someone who helps other people, who gives to them, who teaches them, who encourages them, who makes them stronger, who helps them be happier, who helps other people be more successful. That is the deepest purpose, the most powerful reason to become a confident, fluent English speaker, to become successful in your life. You get it for yourself first, then you give it to other people. That's what I want to teach you how to do. That is what the VIP program is really about. Yes, you will get a lot of great English lessons, which I will tell you about in a later video. But the first thing I want to do is I want to be sure that you understand who this is for. The VIP program is for people who want big, great success in their life, with English, with everything. Personal success, absolutely yes. But not only that. It is also for people who want to have personal success and then they want to share it. They want to give it to other people. They want to teach it. They want to help other people, their family, their friends, their community, their company. It doesn't matter, 1 person or 1,000 people or millions of people. I don't care, but you want to share and help and grow and teach other people and share your success with them. That's who I want, those kind of people. If that's what you want, if you want personal success, to speak confidently, fluently, automatically, and then you want to share it and help other people do the same thing, or you want to use it to connect with other people in the world so you can help them and give and contribute, grow your company and help people in your company, any reason, but I want you to have the idea that you are going to be a leader and share your success. So if that's you, then yes, I want you in VIP. You should get the VIP program. Absolutely, yes, it's for you. This is a special, special group. We will have our own special member site just for VIPs. And we are going to talk about leadership. We are going to help each other become better leaders, better speakers, better teachers, better people, more successful. So, if that's you, keep watching the videos that are coming in the future because you should get this program. You should join this program. If that's not you, you just care about yourself. You don't care about other people. You just want to pass a test. You have no bigger dream. You don't care about contributing or giving to other people. You just want more only for you. You know, okay, that's fine for some people. I'm not judging you. I'm not saying you're bad, but I don't want you in my VIP program. That's just the honest truth. I don't need the money. I don't want your money. And I don't want you to join and get on my member site for my VIPs and be writing about that stuff. I don't want it. So be clear in your mind. If you want personal success, this is for you only if you will share your success in the future, if that's what you also want. Okay, I hope I've been very direct and very clear about who is the VIP program for, who is it not for. And I'll talk about the details in another video, and I'll also give you more ideas about leadership and personal success. So, hope you're having a great day. I love you guys. Mwah, mwah. You know what? The VIP program, the Power English buyers, the Power English students, you guys are my best. You are the real leaders, the true leaders. That's why I love you so much. That's why I'm giving you extra. That's why I will give you everything I can so that you can be successful with English, with everything. Have a great day. I will see you again soon. Bye-bye. Oh, I forgot to push stop. See ya. Bye-bye. Mwah, 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 mwah. Bye bye.